One of the great things about movies is that when they're firing on all cylinders, you can kind of get a little taste of what it might feel like to be on another planet 10,000 years in the future, riding a giant sandworm. The sandworm riding scene in Dune Part 2 is one of the coolest blockbuster set pieces I've seen in a long time. When I saw this scene in theaters, I immediately knew I was going to want to break it down to try to understand why exactly it's so effective. So let's do that. This video is brought to you by Nebula. Click the link in the description below to sign up and watch an exclusive companion video about Dune. The first thing director Denis Villeneuve does that I think helps this scene have as much impact as possible is to not show much worm before this. The sandworms are arguably the most iconic part of Dune's world building. They're a significant feature in the lore and the story itself, and it would be really tempting under these circumstances to show the worms at every possible opportunity. But Denis is actually very stingy with his use of the worms across both films. In this movie, by the time we get to the worm riding scene, which is almost an hour into the film, we've only briefly glimpsed the worm on 2 other occasions. And I think this really pays off. In Part 2, the first time we get a real close encounter with a worm is in the most important scene in the movie that involves a worm. The other thing that really helps sell this scene is the way Denis creates suspense. The actual worm riding itself is like 2.5 minutes long, but there's about 5 minutes of build-up before that. That might not seem like a lot of time, but it's as long as the entire final battle set piece. In a movie where the story is as dense as it is in Dune and where the pace is as fast as it is for most of the film, when you slow the pace down this much, for what is essentially a single story beat, the audience really feels it. From the moment the sequence opens with Paul waking up from a nightmare, Denis is establishing an uneasy feeling that really drives home just how risky riding the worm is.
It's a big day.
Knowing Paul hasn't slept well and watching Chani and Stilgar, 2 characters who are generally pretty fearless, take this very seriously,
don't try to impress anyone,
also helps build suspense and create tension. The pacing slows down even further in the actual build-up to the ride itself. In these long shots, just having to sit here and wait for what we know is going to happen really ratchets up the tension. During this build-up, the sound design really starts doing its work. Right before the ride, we experience one of the quietest moments in the film. This really makes the intensity of the sound that we experience moments later feel even bigger. In movies, it's not just the objective measurable volume that defines the intensity of a sound. Part of what makes something feel intense is the dynamic range of the sound, how loud it is relative to other parts of the film. In this scene, we move from the lowest end of the dynamic range to the highest end of the dynamic range, which really gives the sound of the worm the maximum intensity possible within the film. There's also a real musicality to how the sound of this scene progresses. The thumper creates a rhythm which builds tension, and the sound of the sandworm approaching creates a kind of crescendo. It's a common technique in music, from classical to EDM, to start out with smaller sounds, slowly building tension before momentarily releasing that tension, and then bringing back a fuller sound through a bass drop or by bringing in the full orchestra, and then building the tension further from there. And we see that exact technique used in the sound design of the film in this moment. We'll come back to the sound design and the actual score in a bit, but first we need to talk about the cinematography. I think the way this scene is shot is a big part of what sells its intensity. For cinematographer Greg Fraser, that meant grounding the camera work here in a sense of reality. Here's Fraser talking about this approach in an interview he did with the Dolby Institute podcast.
We tried to have a basis in honesty every time we put a lens on that character.
But what does that even mean when you're talking about shooting something that is entirely fake? Well, when you construct an action set piece like this from a bunch of staged stunts, CGI, and practical effects, you can put the camera in basically whatever position you want and move it through space in all kinds of ways that you wouldn't be able to do if you were somehow filming an actual sandworm ride. What Greg Fraser does is avoid any of those kinds of camera angles or moves. Instead, they try to shoot the scene as if they were actually there filming the real event. This meant staging the camera operators as if they were riding on the worm with Paul, standing on the dunes watching from a distance, or even riding on another sandworm next to Paul filming from that worm. In this entire sequence, there are only 6 quick shots that are from the perspective of a helicopter shot. These are used pretty much to quickly establish a sense of scale, but they aren't the primary angles used to convey the action of the scene. Instead, most of the action is communicated through cameras that are located on the worm with Paul. It keeps us grounded within Paul's perspective and the perspective of the Fremen watching the scene. It's not something you really notice or think about consciously while you're watching the scene, but on an unconscious level, it helps sell the effect. So how is this effect actually done? There are no BTS photos or VFX breakdowns for this scene that have been released yet, so it's hard to know exactly, but Denis did reveal some of how it was done in a video for Vanity Fair. There's definitely a lot of CGI in this film, but Denis' overall ethos when it comes to CGI is to try to use it as much as possible to extend or expand on things that are grounded in a practical effect. This meant, for example, creating a large piece of sandworm skin that could rotate and bounce that a stunt rider could sit on top of while tons of sand were blown past them.
Tons of dust were used.
Or, for example, in this moment, creating a massive fake dune that was propped up by huge cylinders, which they then pulled out from under the dune with trucks while a stunt performer jumped into the collapsing dune. CGI is used to extend the dune, add more sand, add moving parts of the worm, touch things up, but there's a little piece of reality at the core that helps ground it all in a sense of physicality.
We were throwing an insane amount of dust on the stunts.
I also think there's a lot to be said for just how this scene is designed. It might be easy to assume that if you have a big worm riding stunt that you actually want to be able to see the stunt and the worm clearly. But the pure chaos of this moment is a big part of why I think it works so well. It looks like something Paul is barely able to pull off and like he's grappling with a true force of nature. To design the scene this way, the team used reference footage from skiers being hit by avalanches, surfers being hit by massive waves, and water skiing footage. If you watch these kinds of moments from a first-person perspective, they're not technically that visually interesting. You can usually barely see what's happening, there's snow or water flying everywhere, and you can hardly hear. It's a lot more aesthetically interesting to watch somebody water ski or surf from a distance or smoothly carve down a mountain followed by a drone. But that kind of footage doesn't capture what it feels like to be in those moments, feeling that your life might be in danger and the struggle to regain control. It leans into a way of shooting and designing the stunt that ultimately might be less visually pleasing in some sense, but which captures the pure chaos and anxiety of this kind of moment. Speaking of pure chaos, that brings us back to the sound design. As the actual worm ride begins, the sound becomes overwhelmingly intense. There's a real art to crafting a sound that has this much overwhelming intensity but doesn't descend into just pure white noise. If you want an interesting exercise, turn off the video and just listen to this scene with headphones on. You'll really pick up on just how much is going on and how powerful it is on its own without the images. This scene reminds me a lot of one towards the end of Blade Runner 2049. Here, the crashing of waves, the score, and the rain all blend together with such an incredible, overwhelming intensity, seeming to teeter right on that edge of incomprehensible noise. It's a balance that I've seen few directors orchestrate well. This sound is an incredible effect on its own, especially in a theatrical sound system, but the chaos of this sound also has the added effect of making the score more impactful once it does finally come in. I absolutely love the decision to withhold score from most of this scene. Too often I think directors think throwing score at a scene will make the action more intense and exciting, but sometimes the most exciting thing is just letting the sound design do a lot of the work. And then when the score does come in, it has even more impact. And what Hans Zimmer created here feels like a distilled musical version of the chaotic sound of the worm. The sound design also helps keep us fairly grounded in the perspective of Paul. We hear a lot of sounds and his breath as if we're on the interior of his mask. Which brings me to one of the last details I want to mention about this scene, which are the performances. The audio dub performance that goes over an action sequence like this can sometimes be an afterthought and not accomplish very much. But I think Chalamet hits a level of authenticity here with his vocal performance that I think helps sell everything. Obviously, good performances make things better. That's not an original statement, but I think performance is often an overlooked element in action set pieces like this. It's a scene without a lot of performance, but the little pieces of performance we do get work incredibly well, whether it's just the fear in Paul's eyes, the worry we see on Stilgar's face, or Chani's relief. All of this helps the scene and the action feel meaningful to the characters and not just like action for action's sake. If we look at this scene too within the context of the story, I think it's a fascinating one. There's tension about whether or not Paul is this heroic messianic figure. Stilgar believes that him riding the worm will be a fulfillment of a specific prophecy. But when we watch the scene and it feels like Paul himself is just barely accomplishing the task of riding on the back of this worm, it adds an interesting layer of ambiguity to that idea, even though he does end up accomplishing the thing that the prophecy says the Lisan al-Gaib will. We still have this element of doubt because it definitely doesn't look like he did it easily. And the way the triumphant climax of the scene is colored with a more sinister sort of downbeat at the very end foreshadows things to come. Overall, I think it's just an incredibly well-crafted scene that uses so many of the creative aspects of filmmaking all together in concert to create something that's really fun and exciting to watch that still ultimately serves the story and its themes. We can see cinematography, stunt work, performance, sound design, editing, score, practical effects, and CGI all working together in harmony to accomplish something that is genuinely impressive. I think when Denis Villeneuve says that he's not interested in dialogue at all and that pure image and sound is the power of cinema, I think this is the kind of pure image and sound he's talking about. This scene is definitely one of my favorites from both movies, and I can say that pretty confidently because I took both films and edited them together into one 5-hour movie and watched it all in one sitting yesterday. If you want to see my review of this 5-hour version of Dune along with a comparison between the two films, you can watch that right now on Nebula. Just click the link in the description below. In the video, I talk about how seamlessly the two movies fit together, the ways in which they differ, and how I think part 2 improves on part 1. There's this type of sort of scene and feeling that some moments in part 2 have that part 1 does not at all. It's a more casual and laid back review where I touch on a bunch of little things that wouldn't really work as a standalone video on YouTube. But that's what's great about Nebula, Because Nebula is an independent streaming service created by myself and some friends, we have freedom to create content there that wouldn't really work on YouTube. When I make a video exclusively for Nebula, I can use longer examples of score and scenes without having to worry about a video getting instantly demonetized or claimed. After you're done with that video, check out the other Nebula exclusives I've made, including one that breaks down Dune's sound design and this 45-minute essay about the ethics of depicting suffering in cinema. But you don't just get stuff from me. There's a quickly expanding catalog of exclusive content and originals, including new videos from Lindsay Ellis, a whole feature film from Patrick H. Willems, and a bunch of new stuff that's coming soon. And you can watch all our regular YouTube videos without any sponsors or ads, while knowing your subscription is supporting the ongoing work of myself and other great creators. By signing up for Nebula, you're supporting my channel directly and helping me do the best work I can. If you sign up using my link by going to nebula.tv/thomasflight, you'll get 40% off the annual plan, so Nebula will only cost you a little over $2.50 a month. Special thank you to those who have used my link already to sign up for Nebula and support my channel. Nebula is a big part of what makes this channel possible. To join in and get access to all this exclusive Nebula content and to support my work directly, go to nebula.tv/thomasflight or click the link on the screen.